Does anybody remember The Tale of Despereaux? I feel like this movie is sort of a forgotten movie, in a way. I just rewatched it, and I think it deserves to be remembered. Now, I've seen this movie at least 2 times before. I remember specifically that I saw it whenever I was a kid, closer to 2008 whenever this movie came out, maybe 09, maybe 2010 is when I first saw it. And then I saw it again a year ago, maybe 2, because I saw it was on Netflix and I decided that I wanted to watch it just for old time's sake. But last night I watched it again so I could make this video and have it fresh in my mind so I could talk about it without, trying to remember the plot or anything. It's all just fresh in my head and ready to go. When the topic of animated movies comes up, or whenever people are talking about just movies in general, or even kids' movies, this movie hardly ever gets a mention. And I think that's a real shame because, in my opinion, this movie is criminally underrated. The story is surprisingly good for a nearly forgotten movie. I love the narration in this movie. I think that the dialogue is very good for the narration aspect, and I think that not a lot of kids' movies have this sort of narration. So it's something that sets it apart, and it's something that I really enjoy. And while Sigourney Weaver is not someone who immediately comes to mind when I think about narration in movies, she was perfect in this one. Her voice is perfect for the narration in The Tale of Despereaux. I will say, in terms of story and in terms of plot and in terms of dialogue, even for the narrator, I don't know how much credit is actually owed to the original writings, because this movie is based on a book, of course, of the same name, I believe. The Tale of Despereaux is the name of the book as well. And I don't know how much of the dialogue and plot is taken directly from that movie and how much is creative freedom with an adaptation. So while I think that the movie definitely deserves its praises for the things that it does well, the book also deserves some credit. I don't know to what degree because I haven't read the book, but still, you gotta give it some at least. But let's talk about some specifics about things that happened in the movie or details about the movie that I noticed in this watch through, and things that I already knew that I just am finally getting the chance to mention in this video. So the queen dies in this movie because she eats soup that was contaminated by a rat, which it wasn't even contaminated because the rat wasn't in there until after she ate it. But that's neither here nor there. The part that stuck out to me in this particular watch through of the movie is that everyone had the slowest reaction. The princess, the king, everybody. Like, she dies because she's literally yelling like, "There's a rat in my soup," and has a heart attack or whatever and dies. And then the rat gets out, Roscuro gets out onto the table, and then the princess is like, "There's a rat." And then the king, like 3 seconds later, is like, "A rat!" Like, oh my goodness, he's right there. Like, what are we talking about? Why are we stretching 1 second into a million? Like, that's not a dig at the movie or anything, but like, what did you think it was whenever she was yelling 10 seconds ago that there's a rat? It has to be one of the slowest reaction times in all of cinema. I'll put the scene here in case you think I'm exaggerating.
Darling?
Oh, a rat! There's a rat in my soup!
Madam, I know that this is unfortunate, and I know that while on first glance I might have...
A rat in my soup! And I ate it!
Hold on. Uh-oh.
She's right! It's a rat!
Please,
It's a rat!
Something that I've always wondered about this movie is, why is the villain rat, the main villain rat, I still don't know his name after seeing this movie several times. Why is he so long? He's like 2 rats long. Why, like, oh my goodness, I hate looking at him. Like, I really don't, ugh. Something that I really appreciated that this movie did is the contrast between Mouse World and Rat World. Specifically, the first time you go from Mouse World to seeing Rat World for the first time, after only hearing about, the world of the rats in the sewer. I know this may seem stupid because of course they're different. They're described to be different before we ever even see them. But it's not just that one is above ground and one is below ground, or that they look vastly different, or that Mouse World gets light and that Rat World is always in darkness. It's specifically the music change that makes the vibe different for me. That's something that I really appreciate. I love when music really just changes the scene. And I know that happens a lot, but I noticed that specifically this time. And I appreciate that. Musical themes do not necessarily make or break movies and TV shows for me, but what I will say is that a good show or a good movie with good music is a great show or great movie, and a bad project with good musical themes is not so bad. You know, it's something that doesn't get talked about enough, the impact that music in movies and TV shows have on the audience, because it definitely has a good impact on me. I really enjoy the story parallels between Despereaux and Roscuro. While they're very different characters, they are pretty similar because they're both outcasts and ostracized from their respective worlds. Despereaux is kind of an outcast for being too bad for Mouse World, and then Roscuro is kind of an outcast for being too good for Rat World. And that's just something I noticed during this watch through in particular. These two characters are not so different. What separates them the most is just circumstance. Roscuro has been down on his luck for a long time, and a lot of bad things have happened to him, accidents and mishaps and whatnot. And Despereaux is still kind of young. He hasn't been tainted by the world yet. And honestly, the characters would be a lot more similar if it wasn't for just circumstance. And now that I think about it, this movie kind of has some Ratatouille parallels. Not a lot, it's just very minimal, but it's in part a story about a rat and soup/food, and that rat being ostracized from his fellow rats for being different and associating with humans and whatnot. That's just kind of just part of the tale of Despereaux. It's not the overall story like it is in Ratatouille, but it's there. And it's kind of interesting that Ratatouille came out the year prior to Tale of Despereaux. I don't know when the book The Tale of Despereaux came out, but it's one of those weird things where it's two rat movies back-to-back years. There's food involved. It's weird. I wonder if this is one of those situations where one inspired the other. On the one hand, Ratatouille came out the year prior to The Tale of Despereaux, but presumably the book was out before Ratatouille. I don't know when the book came out, but I'm assuming it was out before Ratatouille. So you could say that Ratatouille was inspired by The Tale of Despereaux, the story, but Tale of Despereaux, the movie, could have been made because of the success of Ratatouille, but maybe I'm just making that up, This could be the snake eating its tail, but more likely I'm just, making it up. We already have a lot of weird holidays in the world. We probably already have a National Soup Day in the United States, but we need a worldwide soup day. I'm not talking about, you could eat soup on this day. I'm talking about close school, close work. Let's just all eat soup, whatever that soup of the year is. I think that would bring us together as a people. On a side note, why does animated soup always look so good? The soup in this movie, I want to eat it. The soup in Ratatouille, I want to eat it. Why do I want to eat the fictional soup? Let's talk about some of the characters in The Tale of Despereaux, because this story has some great characters. And I'm not just talking about Despereaux Tilling or Roscuro. I'm talking about all the side characters, all the supporting characters. They're all really good. I think Chef Andre is who I aspire to be in life, to be honest. Just a genius who creates a new soup every year and has a magical cookbook that makes me a best friend out of vegetables. That's the life right there. Chef Andre and Boldo are great characters. They're not in the movie a whole lot, but when they are on screen, they're great. Everything that I see from them is great. And rest in peace to Boldo, by the way. He's one of the great heroes of this movie. Honestly, one of the most pure of heart people. I don't know his story in the book, but at least in the movie, as soon as he found out the princess was in danger, he went for it and he gave his life. And rest in peace to him. He deserved better. And just in case you don't recognize the name Boldo, he's the vegetable best friend. I really enjoyed the character of Hovis, the Threadmaster, in this movie. Even though he's only in the movie for maybe a minute or so, I really enjoyed what we got from him. Because he's an older mouse, he's blind, and he's essentially the executioner for Mouse World. And while he's leading Despereaux to his presumable death, I think that he provides more understanding and encouragement to Despereaux than any other mouse ever did in Mouse World. I really enjoyed the brief conversation that those two characters had, because while it was Hovis' job to cast Despereaux out of Mouse World, he didn't talk to him as if he was an outcast. He talked to him with a level of understanding and normalcy that Despereaux didn't really receive from other mice. And even if he believed that he was sending Despereaux to his death, there's nothing to really say that he believed he could survive down there. But he didn't tell him that. He still just told him to be courageous and to be brave. And I just enjoyed that. And speaking of Despereaux, he's a very familiar character archetype that you see in a lot of stories. The smaller, weaker character that not a lot of people believe in, but who makes up for it with immense courage and going the extra mile that other characters won't. He's a great lead character, if not just a bit familiar. But just because Despereaux's character archetype can be considered common or not very unique, that doesn't do a disservice to the character himself. Because great character archetypes survive so long because they have the potential to have great stories from year in and year out. And this is one of those times where it just works. But what I will say is, while Despereaux is the lead character and while he's the story's namesake, the character of Roscuro is just as important and integral to the story, if not more so, and his character is just a little bit more intriguing. I love that in this story, Roscuro is a very flawed character, but he's still a good person underneath it, or rat anyway. And even though he makes mistakes and he makes bad decisions and he has those flaws, it's nice to be able to root for that character and not just write him off as a villain. It's nice that you, as the audience, want to see him redeem himself, and in the end he does. He comes through and he makes up for his past transgressions. And another thing that makes it easy to root for a character like Roscuro is that even though he is flawed and he makes mistakes, a lot of the things that are bad that surround him aren't necessarily even his fault. It's, again, just circumstance. He just falls into bad circumstance, and that kind of like ruins his life and ruins the kingdom and just kind of ruins the story so that the rest of the story can happen. A lot of what happens to him is just an accident. Mig and her father, the dungeon keeper, Gregory I think is his name, but I'm gonna just call him the dungeon keeper just to be safe. But their story is probably the saddest in the whole movie. And that's really saying something, because everyone's story is sad in this movie. I'm gonna be honest, whenever I rewatched this last night, I got a little teary-eyed whenever he gave up Mig in the flashback when she was a baby. I don't know if that ever hit me as hard as it did this past watch through, but I got a little foggy-eyed, not gonna lie. A lot of characters in this movie make mistakes and do things that you might think would villainize them, but they're still just good people underneath, or decent people at least, so you have to just be able to root for them anyway, and you can. And nothing that Mig does, or Roscuro does, or the Dungeon Keeper, none of them do anything that will turn you against them completely. And in the end, they aren't villains. But this movie does have a few villains. I know that they have the main villain rat, but there's more than that, if we're being real. So let's talk about some of those. Let's just start with the 2 rats long rat, the extra long rat for some reason, very long. I still don't know his name, and I don't know if that's because they didn't mention it in the movie, or if I just didn't hear it, or I just didn't catch it. I don't know, but I don't know his name. He is the main villain, and honestly, he's not the worst person in this movie. Now, I know that everything he does isn't great, but when you think about it, he's no worse than all the other rats in Rat World. Roscuro is really the only good one down there, and he's not from there. He just, stumbled in. But the main villain rat, the long rat, is not any worse than any of the other rats. I would argue that the worst person in this movie is Meg's uncle, because she's left with him as a baby, and he just decides to sell her for the price of a pig. Your own flesh and blood, your niece. Sold. What the hell? And if you ask me, the Mouse Council, the members of the Mouse Council are villains as well. I don't think they're evil, like Mig's uncle, or like the main villain rat, or even just the general populace of rats in Rat World. But they are villains. Now, the council isn't evil because it's not out to do any malicious activity or anything like that. It's just enforcing the rules that are already in place to protect the mice and their way of life. But the thing is that the rules that govern the way of life for the mice, those rules aren't great. Those rules say that you don't act the way we want you to act, or we're gonna send you to the dungeon. And the dungeon is believed by mice to be a death sentence. So the council is essentially sentencing mice to death for not acting the way that they want them to act. Like, I get that there are rules and consequences, but that just doesn't seem right. That seems pretty awful to me. We can't banish mice to live above ground somewhere else. We have to send them down to the dungeon where they're going to be eaten most likely. Why is that the consequence? We can't just tell them, like, go live somewhere else? So again, the Mouse Council is just enforcing the rules that are already in place, but what I will say is that their hands are not clean. Everyone in this movie is sad. Everyone's story is sad. The world is literally sad. There's no rain, there's no color, it's just sadness. And I think that the bleakness that this movie has as its, like, background theme, I guess, I don't know what you would technically call it, but the bleakness in this movie and in this story works in its favor to amplify characters like Despereaux who have heart and who have warmth, and it makes them easy to root for and connect to. I remembered that Emma Watson was in this movie as the princess, but when the opening credits started, I forgot how many people were in this movie. I'm talking about big name actors and actresses. And some of them came back to me immediately. I remembered that Stanley Tucci was in it. As soon as I saw his name, I was like, oh yeah, I knew that at some point. And I remembered that Sigourney Weaver was the narrator as soon as I saw her name. But there's a lot of other actors and actresses that are in this movie that I just completely forgot about. I know I say this for every animated movie I watch, but how are there always so many big name actors and actresses in slightly older animated movies? What was going on back then where it was just a star-studded cast all the time? Roscuro is clearly Dustin Hoffman. I think if you watch this movie and you know what Dustin Hoffman sounds like, there's no missing it. You'll know right away. Here's the one that got me. You're telling me that Matthew Broderick, the voice of Despereaux Tilling, is also Ferris Bueller. And that same Matthew Broderick is the voice of adult Simba in The Lion King, Adam in the Bee Movie, and he plays Inspector Gadget. My mind is kind of blown right now, and I don't know if I should be surprised. Maybe this was common knowledge to other people, but I didn't ever realize the connection with all those characters being the same actor. That's kind of crazy to me. I've already mentioned Sigourney Weaver a couple times, but I'll do it once again briefly. She was perfect casting. She did a great job as the narrator. Loved it. I'm not very familiar with Kevin Kline, who plays Chef Andre, but the thing that stood out to me in his list of past works is that he was the voice of Tulio in The Road to El Dorado, and I didn't even notice. I didn't recognize his voice in these two things, and I guess different accent, different character, but I thought that was cool. By the way, I've made a video about The Road to El Dorado if you want to click on it. Thanks. And Chef Andre's vegetable BFF Boldo was played by the great Stanley Tucci, who I remember being in this movie, sort of. I don't know if you want to count it as I remember, because as soon as I saw his name in the opening credits I remembered, but going into it I didn't necessarily remember. Christopher Lloyd is not someone who I expected to be in this movie. I saw his name in the opening credits, I believe, but when it came time to it, I didn't recognize his voice in the movie. He played Hovis the Threadmaster, and I think he did a great job with the limited time that he had in the movie. Robbie Coltrane was in this movie as Gregory, the Dungeon Keeper. I did write down that his name was Gregory later in my notes, so it is Gregory. But Robbie Coltrane played Gregory, and I didn't recognize him, to be honest. But I don't think I would ever recognize his voice without seeing his face, because I always just picture his voice as being Hagrid. There are some other cast members in this movie that have been in some pretty high-profile things, but I haven't seen those things, so I'm unfamiliar with them. The last one that I'm going to mention is James Nesbitt, played King Philip of Dor. I didn't recognize him whatsoever in this movie, but I've only ever heard his voice with his regular Irish accent, so I'm not super surprised. If you don't know who James Nesbitt is, because he's not a super recognizable name like some of the other people in this cast, he played Beaufort in the Hobbit trilogy, one of my favorite dwarves, by the way. So I thought that was cool. I did not expect him to be in this movie at all, but it's very cool. Overall, I think that The Tale of Despereaux is a very underrated movie. I think it has some strong themes and messages that don't appear in a lot of other kids' movies. A lot of kids' movies deal with grief and loss, you know. How many animated movies have a character that doesn't have a mom or a dad or parents at all, or something happens to someone, you know? That's kind of a thing that happens in a lot of animated movies, but I think this movie does an especially good job of tackling grief and loss in a more in-depth way, especially with the narration that accompanies the things that are happening on screen. I think that's just a great way to go about it. I think that this movie has a good soundtrack, and the animation for the most part holds up. I think that the weak spots in the animation are some of the human characters. Some of them are fine. I think Chef Andre is fine. But some of them just aren't quite there. Everything else, though, is adequate. It's a real shame that this movie is all but forgotten, because I think it's better than people give it credit for. The 56% on Rotten Tomatoes isn't super surprising, even though it sucks. But what bothers me the most is the 50% Google user reviews. Y'all telling me that half of y'all don't like this movie? Come on, it's not that bad. That's a travesty. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this movie is based on a book, and so there's that aspect to everything. People could be saying they don't like it because it doesn't live up to the original story, or it doesn't do that story justice, or it's not even accurate to the original story. I don't know because I haven't read the book. But if you have read the book, let me know. How does it compare? How does the movie compare to the book? And what do you think of the movie? Somehow I've been watching a lot of animated movies recently about small characters who have a lot of courage but aren't taken seriously. Valiant, Chicken Little, and now The Tale of Despereaux. I swear I'm not doing it on purpose, but the last few videos that I put out on the channel, for the most part, have been small characters, courage, not taken seriously. I don't know what's happening. I don't know why I'm being drawn to watch these things, but it is what it is. Maybe the next one will be different, maybe it won't. But that's all I've got to say about The Tale of Despereaux. I'm glad I rewatched it. It was a good time. I had a fun time. And I think it's really easy to watch for me personally, and I would recommend it. But if you stuck around through this video, thanks for sticking around. Not a lot of people do, so I appreciate you. If you want to help me out here on YouTube, liking this video, commenting, subscribing to the channel, or checking out some of my other videos would all help me grow the YouTube channel, which I'm still trying to do. And until next time, let me leave you with the best clip from this movie.
Hello? What are you doing?
I need it for a baby.